The night air in Chicago was heavy with a sticky kind of silence, the sort that settled after the chaos of the day but held the promise of more trouble. Streetlights flickered in a steady rhythm, casting orange hues on empty sidewalks. Amara Johnson adjusted her blazer with one hand as she gripped the steering wheel with the other, humming softly to a jazz tune playing on the radio. It had been a long day at the courthouse. Another grueling trial where she had fought tooth and nail for a client unjustly accused. But there was satisfaction too, the kind that only came from standing on the right side of justice. As she turned onto Ashland Avenue, the headlights of a patrol car flared in her rearview mirror. It wasn't the first time she had been followed, but something in the way the cruiser hugged her tail made her stomach twist. Red and blue lights bloomed suddenly behind her like sirens of doom. She pulled over with a sigh, reaching instinctively into her glove compartment for her license and registration. Her movements were careful, deliberate. She knew too well the stakes of a wrong gesture. A tall figure approached the driver's side. His face was pale under the street lamp, jaw clenched, eyes already narrowed with suspicion before a word was exchanged. "License and registration," he barked. Amara kept her voice even. "Yes, officer. I have them right here." He snatched the documents from her hand without a glance. "What are you doing in this neighborhood at this hour?" "I'm heading home from work." "At this time?" He leaned in closer, squinting. "You don't look like you belong here." Amara felt the familiar sting of bile rising in her throat. "I'm a lawyer. I just left the courthouse." He smirked. "A lawyer? Right." His eyes traveled around the interior of her Lexus, pausing at the leather briefcase in the passenger seat. "Step out of the vehicle." "Excuse me?" I said step out. "Now." She hesitated, and that was all it took. In one swift motion, he yanked open the door, grabbed her by the wrist, and forced her onto the pavement. Her knees scraped against the asphalt as her briefcase fell open, papers scattering into the gutter. "What are you doing?" she shouted, the panic rising despite her years of training. "You fit a description," he muttered, cuffing her hands behind her back with a zip tie that bit into her skin. "What description? I haven't done anything." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence spoke in volumes that centuries of systemic racism had already translated. As she sat there on the curb, humiliated and bruised, Amara stared at the puddle forming beneath her. In its murky reflection, she didn't see a criminal. She saw a woman who had spent her life fighting for justice, now forced to taste the bitter irony of injustice herself. The holding cell was cold and stank of bleach and sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the gray walls. Amara sat on the metal bench, her arms folded tightly over her chest, trying to preserve whatever warmth she had left. It had been hours. They hadn't told her why she was being held. No phone call, no explanation, just a vague mumble about pending verification. Her mind, razor sharp in court, now reeled in disbelief. She wasn't supposed to be here, not her. But tonight, credentials meant nothing. Skin color was the only credential that mattered. A group of officers walked by outside the cell, laughing about something. One of them looked in her direction and snickered. "That her?" he asked the officer beside him. "Yeah," claimed she's some big shot lawyer. The second one said with a grin. "Said we'll regret this." The first officer laughed, loud and mean. "They all say that. She'll be gone by morning. Probably file a complaint. And nothing will happen. Business as usual." Amara closed her eyes and breathed in deeply, forcing herself to remain still. Rage bubbled under her skin like boiling tar. But rage, she knew, was a tool that had to be wielded carefully, especially when the world expected her to lose control. At dawn, they released her. No charges, no apology, just a signature on a flimsy release form and a guard who said, "You're lucky," as if she had escaped something worse. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Sunlight spilled over the skyline in hazy gold. But for Amara, the world had lost its color. She looked down at her scraped palms, the imprint of the zip ties still etched into her wrists. She whispered to herself, "This ends here. I'm not going to let this go." Back in her high-rise apartment overlooking Millennium Park, Amara stood beneath the shower, letting the water wash away the grime of the cell. But nothing could wash away the indignity. Nothing could erase the image of herself on the pavement, of the officer's sneer, of the laughter in the precinct hall. She dressed slowly, methodically, a tailored black suit, modest heels, a silver pin shaped like the scales of justice on her lapel. In the mirror, she no longer saw just a woman. She saw a force. By midday, she had called in favors, journalists, fellow attorneys, community leaders. She told them everything. No exaggeration, no dramatization, just the truth. And the truth was incendiary enough. One of the reporters, a young Latina named Camila Santos, had tears in her eyes as she recorded Amara's statement. "They knew who you were?" she asked. "No," Amara said. "And that's the point. They didn't care." Camilla's article hit the web like a lit match in a dry forest. Titled, "Lawyer or Not, She Was Still Black First." The story chronicled Amara's arrest, her credentials, and the long list of similar cases in the city. It was raw, it was angry, and it was true. The hashtag justice for Amara began trending within hours. But Amara wasn't done. That evening, she contacted the city's Civilian Office of Police Accountability and filed an official complaint. She didn't just name Travis Cole, she named the others too. She provided photos of her bruises, medical reports, and a transcript of her own recollections. Every detail, every moment. And she began calling in allies. Retired judges, civil rights attorneys, activists, even members of Congress. She would not only expose the officer, she would expose the system that allowed him to wear a badge. Travis Cole was sipping his third beer when his phone buzzed. He was home, feet on the coffee table, the game humming on the television behind him. He didn't recognize the number. But curiosity won. "Officer Cole?" said a clipped voice on the line. "Speaking. This is Lieutenant Ramirez. You need to report to HQ. Now." "Sir? It's my day off. You need to get down here. You're under internal investigation." Travis froze. "What the hell is this about?" "Your arrest last night. The woman you brought in, she's not who you thought she was." Click. 20 minutes later, Travis sat in the Internal Affairs office. The buzz of fluorescent lights echoing too loudly in the silence. A folder sat on the table in front of him, thick and ominous. Across from him, a stern-faced officer began reading aloud the complaint filed against him. False arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, public humiliation, physical assault. Travis shifted in his seat. She was resisting. "Surveillance footage says otherwise. You never activated your body cam. We also have statements from multiple witnesses." She wasn't resisting. She was asking why she was being detained. She was mouthy. She's a civil rights attorney with the American Justice Project. She's argued before the Supreme Court. "For Christ's sake, you assaulted one of the most powerful lawyers in the country, and now it's in the press. You're in deep shit." Cole. For the first time in his career, Travis felt something foreign claw at the edges of his confidence. Fear. And Amara? She was just getting started. The news spread like wildfire. In the hours following Camila Santos' article, the story of Amara Johnson, wrongfully arrested, humiliated, and assaulted, found its way into newsrooms across the country. National anchors debated it on primetime television. Morning radio shows dissected every detail. Twitter and Instagram exploded with outrage. Photos of Amara in courtrooms, commanding and poised, were juxtaposed against headlines about her unlawful detainment. The image of a zip tie scar imprinted on her wrist became symbolic, shared thousands of times. A silent testimony to everything she'd endured. She hadn't planned on becoming a symbol. But now, she was. The hashtag justice for Amara wasn't just trending. It had become a movement. Amara sat by the window of her apartment, phone buzzing non-stop on the coffee table behind her. She didn't answer. Her gaze drifted to the street below where protesters had begun to gather. Homemade signs bobbed in the crowd. One read, "She fought for US, now we fight for her." Her fingers trembled slightly as she touched the edge of the scar on her wrist. The memory was still fresh. Visceral. The concrete. The cold hands. The laughter. But now, there was momentum. She stood up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling down a weathered folder filled with affidavits and personal testimonies. These weren't hers. They belonged to others, young black men and women, working-class parents, immigrants, people who had come to her office over the years, looking for help after their own brushes with injustice. They hadn't had media attention. Most of them never saw a courtroom. That night, Amara went live on her social media for the first time in years. No polished speech, no filters, Just her and the truth. She looked directly into the camera. This is not just about me. It never was. This is about every person who's ever been stopped for looking suspicious. Every voice that was silenced by a badge. Every bruise justified by a false report. I may have power now, but I remember the days when I didn't. And I know what it's like to be invisible. No more. Not for me. Not for anyone. The video went viral within minutes. And the streets answered with thunder. The press conference took place in front of the city courthouse. Under a gray sky that threatened rain. A small podium had been set up. And cameras formed a half circle. Lenses aimed and waiting. Reporters elbowed for space. Their notepads fluttering in the wind. A sea of voices murmured until the door behind the podium opened and Amara stepped out. She wore black again, sharp and unflinching, with her hair pulled back and a gold pin glinting at her collar. There was a hush as she approached the microphone. I stand here today not as a victim, but as a witness, she said, her voice cutting through the air. A witness to a system that allows certain officers to wield fear as a weapon and racism as a shield. A system that sees black skin not as a fact of birth, but as a threat. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. What happened to me was not an accident. It was the result of conditioning. Of unchecked bias. Of institutions that have failed to protect the very people they're sworn to serve. I was lucky. I had resources, allies, a voice, but many others do not. That is why I will not be silenced. That is why I am filing a civil rights lawsuit against Officer Travis Cole and the Chicago Police Department for false arrest, physical assault, and racial discrimination. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Questions exploded from every direction. But Amara raised her hand calmly. I will be speaking only through my legal team from this point forward. She said, but know this. This is not just about accountability. It is about change. Then she turned and walked away. The silence behind her louder than applause. Travis Cole watched the broadcast from the break room of his precinct. Jaw clenched, fingers digging into a styrofoam cup until it buckled. Around him, no one said a word. Some avoided eye contact, others whispered behind his back. Later that night, his front lawn was vandalized. Spray painted across the white siding of his home in bold black letters were the words, "The badge isn't a shield." By the end of the week, the city was in turmoil. Protests had intensified. Crowds gathered outside the precinct where Travis worked, chanting demands for justice. Marches took place every night, organized by youth collectives, activist groups, and ordinary citizens. What began as outrage over Amara's arrest had become a citywide reckoning with decades of systemic abuse. Inside the legal halls of the city, a different kind of war was unfolding. Amara's legal team, 5 fierce lawyers from across the country, set up base in her office. They weren't just building a civil suit. They were preparing to expose the entire pattern of misconduct that enabled officers like Travis Cole to operate with impunity. Her lead co-counsel, Marcus Fields, had a commanding presence and a memory like a blade. He'd spent 2 decades dismantling corrupt law enforcement systems from within. Together, they compiled a case file that grew thicker by the hour. There were other victims. An older man who had been pistol-whipped during a traffic stop in 2017. A college student accused of resisting arrest while walking home. A mother whose teenage son was hospitalized after a routine search. All of them had one thing in common. They'd all filed complaints about Officer Travis Cole, and all of them had been ignored. Amara called a private meeting with the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. She brought the testimonies, the photos, the internal reports. She laid it all on the table. You've had this man on your force for 10 years, she said, and in that time, at least 19 formal complaints have been filed. How many more didn't bother? Because they knew it was useless? The director of the office looked pale. Ms. Johnson, if this becomes public, it's already public, she interrupted. This isn't just about public relations. It's about people's lives. Back at home, Amara barely slept. Her phone continued to buzz, celebrities, lawmakers, community leaders wanting to show support. But beneath all the attention, there was a storm gathering. And she could feel it. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was changing. Officers whispered in hallways. Commanders held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Travis Cole, once brash and untouchable, was now avoided. His presence had become a liability. On a rainy Thursday morning, He was summoned to internal affairs once again. This time, the room felt colder. A woman in a navy suit stood waiting. She didn't introduce herself. "Mr. Cole," she began, "new evidence has come to light. We have footage from a civilian dashcam showing you pulling Ms. Johnson from her vehicle. You did not identify yourself. You did not state a reason for the stop. You used force before any sign of resistance. This footage matches Ms. Johnson's statement in full." Travis crossed his arms. She was acting suspicious. "I was doing my job." The woman placed a thick folder on the table and opened it. Inside were printed copies of complaints, old disciplinary records, even anonymous reports from his peers. His career laid bare. "You were doing something," she said, "but it wasn't policing. You're now under suspension pending the outcome of both an internal investigation and the civil lawsuit. And I suggest you find a lawyer." He tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. Outside, the city roared with the voices of protest. Inside, the silence around Travis Cole was deafening. Amara, meanwhile, stood by her office window, watching the rain streak down the glass. Her fingers hovered over a folder marked, Phase 2. The first battle was won. But the war was just beginning. The conference room at Amara's law office buzzed with quiet energy. Stacks of files were neatly arranged on a long oak table. Laptops glowed in front of each chair. It had become a war room, part legal strategy center, part sanctuary for truth seekers. Everyone around that table knew the stakes were higher than a civil suit. Amara stood at the head of the table, tapping a pen gently against her notepad as she addressed her assembled allies, lawyers, activists, law professors, and a few trusted journalists. The room was diverse in age, race, and background, but unified in purpose. "We are not just litigating a lawsuit," she said, voice steady and precise. "We're building the foundation for systemic reform." On a whiteboard behind her were written 5 names, each representing victims of excessive force by Travis Cole. But they were only the beginning. Over the last 2 weeks, Amara's team had uncovered a disturbing pattern. Complaints against Cole had either vanished, been mysteriously closed, or had been resolved with no follow-up. Several were filed by citizens who couldn't afford attorneys and had since fallen silent. Amara wanted to find those people. Marcus Fields was already on it. He had contacted each individual, and one by one, they began to agree to speak, quietly at first, then more boldly, as Amara's story gave them courage. She set up private interviews in her office and provided security and legal protection to each of them. She listened, carefully, as grown men described being treated like animals, as single mothers fought back tears reliving nights their sons didn't come home, as a teenage girl detailed how Travis Cole called her a criminal in training during the stop and frisk. Despite having done nothing wrong, these stories weren't isolated, they were systemic. Amara decided to call them together. In a quiet cafe in Bronzeville, Amara held a private gathering. Those who had once been silent victims now sat face to face with each other for the first time. "You don't know me," Amara began, "but you know what I've been through. And I know what you've been through. What they did to us wasn't personal. It was policy. They relied on your silence. They thought mine would come at a higher price. They were wrong." One of the attendees, a middle-aged man named Darnell who had spent a week in jail after a wrongful arrest, raised his hand. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Amara's answer was quiet but powerful. "Your voice." That night, 5 of them agreed to testify as part of a broader case, not just against Travis Cole, but against the institutional failures that had protected him. A movement was no longer just in the streets. It was now inside the courtroom walls, behind the imposing brick facade of the 17th District Precinct. Panic had started to simmer just beneath the surface. Not open chaos, yet, but quiet, relentless unraveling, the kind that came when secrets could no longer be contained. Travis Cole sat at his desk, suspended from duty but still technically employed, awaiting further administrative review. He wasn't in uniform. He hadn't worn the badge in days. It felt like armor he had taken for granted, now stripped away. His colleagues no longer greeted him with nods or casual jokes. He was radioactive. Worse, some had begun to talk. A rookie officer named Jason Kelly, just 18 months on the force, had submitted a confidential statement to Internal Affairs. In it, he admitted that he'd witnessed Travis tamper with his body cam footage more than once. He described seeing officers high-five each other after particularly aggressive stops, and how Travis would refer to clean sweeps in predominantly black neighborhoods. But it wasn't just Kelly. Detective Lauren Griggs, a 10-year veteran and single mother of two, was next. In a private meeting with the deputy commissioner, she recounted how Travis bragged during locker room conversations about how he could always make it look clean when things got out of hand. She even produced an old text message he'd sent after a violent arrest. Joking, "Bet he won't forget who's in charge now." The dam had cracked. By the end of the week, 5 officers had come forward. Some were driven by guilt, others by fear. A few simply knew the winds were changing, and they didn't want to go down with the ship. And Travis? He felt it. For the first time in his life, he wasn't protected. There was no shield behind which he could hide, no silence to protect him. His phone stopped ringing. His union representative became distant. His supervisor wouldn't return his calls. At home, the pressure mounted. Protesters gathered outside his house each night. Candles lit, signs held high. "We see you. Justice is coming. Your badge doesn't erase your crimes." His wife left. His son stopped speaking to him. He stood in his living room one night, staring out at the people chanting his name with disgust. And for the first time, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had finally gone too far. Amara stood alone in the city archives building, the scent of aged paper and old ink hanging heavy in the air. She combed through boxes of personnel files, complaint records, redacted reports. With the help of a sympathetic city clerk, she had gained access to older archives, files that had mysteriously gone missing during the official investigations. And there, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and faded memos, she found it. A case file from 5 years ago. Darius Fenn, a black teenager, just 16, stopped on suspicion of shoplifting outside a convenience store. No stolen goods were ever found. 2 officers were present, one listed as primary, Travis Cole. The report claimed Darius resisted arrest and fell during pursuit, resulting in a fatal skull fracture. Case closed. Internal review concluded, reasonable force. No disciplinary action, no charges. But Amara noticed something odd. The witness statement was missing. Entire pages were redacted. Even the officer's body cam footage was unavailable due to technical failure. Amara's pulse quickened. This wasn't just misconduct. This was a cover-up. She reached out to Darius's mother, a woman named Tanisha Fenn, who now lived in a modest apartment on the south side. Tanisha hadn't spoken to anyone about the case in years. The pain had calcified, buried beneath layers of bitterness and resignation. When Amara introduced herself, Tanisha's eyes narrowed. "You're the one in the papers. The lawyer they arrested." "Yes," Amara replied, "but this isn't about me. It's about Darius." The name alone caused a visible tremble in the woman's hands. "They said he tripped," she whispered, "that it was an accident. I saw his face in that morgue. Miss Johnson, his head was caved in. That was no fall." Amara gently took her hand. "Would you be willing to talk about it, on the record?" Tanisha hesitated. Then slowly, she nodded. That night, Amara couldn't sleep. She sat at her desk staring at a photo of Darius, wide smile, basketball in hand. Just a kid. Another life erased. Another story hidden. Not anymore. She would bring it to light. The following morning, Amara called an emergency meeting at the city courthouse. Her team gathered in the same room where they had mapped out their initial case. But now, the stakes had grown. Amara stood at the center of the room, holding the reopened file on Darius Fenn in her hands. "This isn't just a civil case anymore," she said. "This is criminal. Travis Cole didn't just assault me. He killed a boy, and the department buried it." The room fell into silence. Then Marcus spoke. "We need a federal prosecutor." "I've already called one," Amara said. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Olivia Hall. She's agreed to meet tomorrow." Within 24 hours, Amara sat across from Olivia Hall in a glass-walled office overlooking the river. The federal attorney was sharp-eyed, calm, and possessed the kind of focus Amara deeply respected. "You believe this case involves a pattern of civil rights violations?" Olivia asked. "I don't believe it," Amara replied. "I know it, and I can prove it." She placed the file on the table. Witnesses, statements, patterns, a web of silence. And at the center of it all, Travis Cole. Olivia flipped through the pages slowly. When she finished, she closed the file and looked up. "I'll open a federal investigation. If what you've presented holds up, we'll pursue criminal charges." Amara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with possibility. Change no longer felt like a distant dream. It was taking shape, one document, one testimony, one truth at a time. And though the road ahead was long, Amara knew one thing for certain. The walls were cracking, and soon, the whole rotten structure would fall. The first day of the trial arrived beneath a steel-gray sky. The kind that made the city feel as if it were holding its breath. Crowds lined the courthouse steps by sunrise, their voices a murmured tide of hope and anticipation. Signs waved in the wind: justice for Amara, justice for Darius, justice for all. Some held photos of Darius Fenn, others clutched copies of the Constitution. The courtroom had become a battleground, and everyone knew it. Inside, Amara Johnson stood in a dark blue suit that hugged her frame with quiet power. Her team moved around her like satellites, Marcus Fields reviewing last-minute notes, a young paralegal flipping through witness statements, court clerks confirming press credentials. There were at least 6 news cameras trained on the doors. Amara looked around the room. It was packed: activists, off-duty officers, law students, politicians. She spotted Tanisha Fenn in the gallery, her face composed but tight with grief. Darnell sat next to her, his fingers steepled in his lap. Camila Santos sat behind them, a press badge around her neck and a pen already moving. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened, and Travis Cole walked in. He looked thinner. The arrogance that had once dripped from his every movement now hung limp like wet clothes on a line. His lawyer, a high-priced defense attorney with a reputation for spinning brutality into protocol, whispered in his ear as they approached the defense table. The judge entered, and everyone stood. "Be seated," said Judge Eleanor Brandt, her voice clear and cold. She was known for her fairness and her steel spine. No theatrics would survive in her court. Opening arguments began. Marcus Fields delivered a razor-sharp summary, a systematic pattern of abuse hidden beneath the surface of routine policing. He spoke of Amara's arrest, of the missing complaints, of Darius Fenn. He told the jury this was not a matter of one bad officer, but a structure that protected and rewarded violence. When the defense attorney stood, he spun a different tale. A noble officer caught in a storm of misinterpretation. He suggested Amara escalated the encounter, that her fame made the incident political. He framed Darius Fenn's death as a tragic accident, twisting a mother's mourning into doubt. Amara didn't flinch. She had weathered worse storms, and she wasn't done fighting. The second day of trial brought the first witnesses. Amara took the stand herself, recounting every second of her arrest. She spoke plainly, without embellishment, letting the facts speak. But it wasn't her words that moved the jury, it was her restraint. The way she refused to reduce herself to anger. The way her voice wavered only once. When she described how it felt to be yanked out of her car like a criminal in front of no one but the stars. "They didn't see a woman," she said softly. "They saw a threat." Cross-examination was aggressive. The defense tried to rattle her, insinuate her success made her dramatic, that she was performing outrage. But Amara remained calm. She reminded the jury that the night she was arrested, she didn't tell them she was a lawyer. She wasn't playing the system. She was simply trying to survive it. After her testimony, Tanisha Fenn was called to the stand. The courtroom grew still as she walked up, every footstep echoing. She held a photo of Darius in her lap as she spoke, her voice no louder than a whisper at first. "He was just walking home," she said. "He had headphones in. He didn't hear them when they shouted. They said he ran. I don't know if he ran, but I know he didn't deserve to die." She described how the department had ghosted her after the incident, how they called it a clean case, handed her a body, and closed the door. The defense objected repeatedly: irrelevant, emotional, hearsay, but Judge Brandt overruled most of it. The testimony stood. The damage was done. The next witnesses were the others: Darnell, the college student, the young woman frisked at 17. One by one, their stories poured into the room like water into a basin that had long stood dry. Each had been dismissed, ignored, or intimidated. Now they stood on equal ground. On the fourth day, the jury saw the dashcam footage of Amara's arrest. The room watched in silence as the grainy video showed Travis approaching her car. yanking open the door, dragging her out without warning. No cause, no struggle, just violence. The defense tried to claim the footage lacked sound and context. But by now, the jury didn't need sound. They had seen the system speak loud enough already. That evening, after a marathon day in court, Amara stood outside alone. The sun had dipped below the skyline, casting long shadows between the courthouse columns. Reporters gathered like moths, but she ignored them. A voice behind her broke the silence. "You were incredible in there." She turned. It was Olivia Hall, the assistant U.S. attorney who had opened the federal investigation into Cole. Her eyes were tired but kind. "Tomorrow we go public," Olivia said. "We're filing federal civil rights charges. We have enough: abuse of power, falsified reports, obstruction of justice." Amara nodded. "And Darius?" "Manslaughter," Olivia confirmed. "And if we get the original coroner to testify, maybe even second-degree murder." Amara looked up at the sky, at the first stars appearing in the dusky canvas. "It's not enough," she murmured. "Even if we convict him, even if he spends time in prison, that boy's still gone. And there are others, so many others." "I know," Olivia said, "but it's a start." They stood together in silence. Two black women, different paths, same war. For a moment, Amara let herself feel the weight of it all. The years, the exhaustion, the dreams deferred and the ones fought for tooth and nail. Later that night, she returned home to find a letter slipped beneath her door. It was handwritten, no return address. Inside, a short message. "I saw what they did to you. I saw what they did to Darius. I used to be one of them. Not anymore. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything." No signature, just a single badge number at the bottom. Amara's hands trembled as she read it again. She knew what this meant. Someone from inside had finally broken. The next morning, the world shifted. The mysterious whistleblower, Officer Joseph Harris, came forward under protection, a 10-year veteran of the force. He had kept his silence for too long, but Amara's story, the trial, Darius's face in the news, had changed him. His conscience had clawed its way to the surface. Under oath, he testified that Travis Cole had bragged about putting that Fenn kid down. He claimed Travis falsified his reports regularly and that superior officers often looked the other way. He even alleged that some complaints were deliberately purged by internal affairs in exchange for silence or favors. The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order, banging her gavel as jurors sat frozen, absorbing what they had just heard. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about a network of complicity. A cathedral of silence, now brought to its knees by the voice of one man who had finally remembered what justice looked like. Back at the precinct, chaos reigned. Internal affairs began issuing subpoenas. The department suspended 5 officers linked to the cover-ups. The police union held a press conference. But their platitudes sounded hollow against the tidal wave of truth crashing through the city. For Amara, the victory was not yet won, but the tides were turning. On the courthouse steps, with the media pressing around her, she spoke once more. "This is not the end," she said. "This is only the middle. There are still names we don't know. Still doors that need to be opened. But today, we saw what happens when silence is broken. When truth is louder than fear. Let it echo. Let it spread." Her voice was clear, her eyes steady. And behind her, the people cheered, not just for her, but for themselves. For the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like a fantasy. It felt like a promise. The weeks after Officer Joseph Harris' testimony blurred into long, restless days and nights, each one folding into the next like pages of a closing book. The court of public opinion had already spoken. News outlets flooded their front pages with images of Amara beside grieving families, excerpts from witness testimony, and video stills of Travis Cole dragging her from her car like a sack of trash. But it was the courtroom, heavy with wood, law, and ghosts, where the real reckoning would be decided. On the 21st day of the trial, the prosecution rested. Amara and Marcus sat side by side, exhaustion written in the lines around their eyes. But in their posture, there was something else: pride, resolve. They had made their case. Thoroughly, completely. The paper trail was undeniable. The testimonies rang like a bell no one could unhear. And the story of Darius Fenn, his face, his youth, his violent end, hovered like a spirit over every moment. Then came the defense. They brought out a psychologist to suggest that Amara, having experienced prior racial trauma, may have interpreted Officer Cole's behavior through a distorted lens, that she had projected historical pain onto a standard police encounter. Marcus leapt to object, and the judge sustained, but not before the psychologist had planted the seed of doubt. They produced grainy character witnesses, old schoolmates of Travis who called him respectful and lawful. The defense attorney painted Travis as a man under siege, vilified by the media, abandoned by the city he served. But even as he spoke, jurors shifted in their chairs. Unconvinced, Travis himself took the stand on the 25th day. His eyes were bloodshot. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the mic. He began with a show of humility, saying how hard policing was, how he made mistakes, how he never meant to harm anyone. But the further he went, the more the cracks showed. When questioned by the prosecution, his voice faltered. "Mr. Cole," Marcus asked, standing squarely before him, "you said you feared for your safety the night you arrested Ms. Johnson. Did she threaten you?" Travis paused. "She was non-compliant." "In what way?" She asked too many questions." "And that scared you?" A beat of silence. "Yes." Laughter rippled softly in the courtroom. Judge Brandt slammed her gavel. "Order." But it was too late. The mask had slipped. He sounded not like a protector, but a coward, a man used to power, now crumbling in its absence. By the end of the week, the jury was ready. The courthouse was silent on the morning of the verdict. Yet the air pulsed with anticipation. It was standing room only in the gallery. Reporters lined the walls. Amara sat alone at her table, her hands folded tightly together. Her breath moved slow and deliberate. This was the moment she had relived 1,000 times in her mind. Not for herself, she could weather anything, but for Darius's mother. For the countless others who never got this day. Tanisha Fenn sat behind her, clutching a folded handkerchief. Her eyes already wet with hope or fear, it was impossible to tell. The jury filed in, each of them carrying the invisible weight of the truth they had been trusted to hold. The foreperson stood. "In the matter of the People versus Officer Travis Cole," she began, voice trembling, "on the charge of assault under color of authority, we find the defendant guilty." Gasps fluttered through the gallery. "On the charge of falsifying police records, guilty." Amara closed her eyes. Briefly, silently. "On the charge of second-degree manslaughter in the death of Darius Fenn, guilty." A sob escaped from Tanisha's chest. She covered her mouth, as if even joy felt dangerous. One of the jurors wept openly. Others nodded solemnly, eyes red-rimmed, as though they too had just exhaled after holding their breath for far too long. The judge asked Travis to rise. He did, barely. He swayed slightly as he stood, shoulders slack, face pale. The man who once sneered in interrogation rooms now looked like he could barely hold up his own name. Judge Brandt's voice rang out, steady and unforgiving. "This court finds that Officer Travis Cole not only broke the law, but used the law as a weapon against the people he swore to protect. He is hereby remanded into custody pending sentencing. Bail is denied." Court officers moved toward him. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The very sound felt like thunder. As he was led away, Amara finally turned, making eye contact with him just once. She expected anger, or shame, or even hate, but what she saw was emptiness. A man without armor, stripped of the illusion of righteousness, devoured by his own cowardice. Outside the courthouse, the city erupted, not in chaos, but in relief, in triumph, in celebration. People danced in the streets. They cried. They embraced. Strangers held hands beneath banners of solidarity. It wasn't a parade, it was an exhale that had waited generations to be released. And Amara? She stood on the courthouse steps, holding Tanisha's hand, and for the first time in years, she smiled. The weeks after the verdict were unlike anything Amara had known. She was invited to speak at universities, human rights conferences, police reform panels. National figures, senators, authors, celebrities, quoted her statements. Her inbox overflowed with messages from people across the country. Survivors of police violence, former officers who regretted their silence, mothers who cried for her strength. But she didn't care about fame. She cared about impact. She worked with Olivia Hall and the Department of Justice to begin crafting legislative proposals. A bill, the Fenn Act, was introduced in Congress. aimed at federal oversight of police departments with patterns of civil rights violations. It demanded transparency, mandatory body cam use, and third-party investigations for use of force cases. Amara was one of the lead drafters. The FEN Act sparked fierce debate. Police unions protested, pundits screamed on television, but across the nation, public support surged. Meanwhile, Amara returned to her roots. She established the Equal Vision Legal Fund, a nonprofit offering free legal representation for victims of police misconduct. She staffed it with a mix of seasoned attorneys and young law students hungry to fight. Their motto: truth has no rank. Every morning, Amara walked into her office, passing a mural that now adorned the lobby wall. It showed the faces of Darius Fenn, Tanisha, Officer Harris, Amara herself, and beneath them, a simple phrase: they tried to bury us. They didn't know we were seeds. The city had changed, not completely, not perfectly, but something fundamental had shifted. People now believed that power could be held accountable. And that was a beginning. The sun poured golden light over the plaza as Amara approached the podium. The National Memorial for Victims of Injustice had just been unveiled in Washington, D.C., and she was the keynote speaker. The stage was framed by white marble columns, inscribed with names, thousands of them, of those whose stories had never been told, or had been buried by indifference. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. I was once dragged from my car and thrown to the ground by a man who wore a badge. She began. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't care. But I knew who I was. And I refused to disappear. Silence fell like a veil over the crowd. But this isn't a story about revenge. It's about accountability. It's about what happens when we decide that silence is no longer acceptable. When we decide that justice cannot be limited to the privileged few. She turned toward the wall of names behind her. These names, these lives, are not just history. They are our charge, our reminder, our call to action. And for every system that has ever said we were powerless, let today be our answer. She stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause. Later that evening, alone in her hotel room, she opened a letter delivered by the event staff. No signature, just a sentence written in careful, looping script. Because of you, my daughter wants to be a lawyer. She says you wear justice like armor. Thank you for reminding her that she can, too. Amara smiled, tears pricking her eyes. She looked out the window, where the Capitol dome glowed in the distance, and whispered, "This is just the beginning." Then she sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and began drafting the next case. Because the fight for justice was never about one verdict, or one courtroom, or one man. It was a lifetime's work. And she was ready.